Let us reach this generation, every tribe and every nation, for we've overcome the world by the blood of Christ the Lamb. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We do our marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and tower. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Rock of We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We do our marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and tower. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Rock of ages. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light. We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We do our marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We do our marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty.
Good morning. How you doing? Why don't we just open in prayer? So, dear God, thank you for bringing us all here together to study your word and study this important topic and how we love our spouse. Please make our thoughts and words and conversations honoring to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Okay, good. So, today's topic, the avoider, right? So the avoider, I mean, just as a quick thumbnail, the avoider is someone who struggles with sharing their thoughts and their emotions and their feelings. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I happen to be an avoider, so I don't have a whole lot to share with you today. So I'm just going to jump right to the Q&A. If no Q&A, I'll just close in prayer. So good luck. Hey, so I want to just sort of even go back a little bit to the last 2 weeks. So both, Don and Laura, they did a great job in terms of sort of setting this up. A lot of really good information. And we learned a lot about Don, who's always really gracious about letting us into his home, letting us into his thoughts and whatnot. We learned one thing from Don. He's not an avoider. So he's definitely not an avoider. He has no trouble sharing his thoughts and his feelings. And he has no trouble sharing his thoughts and feelings about his spouse, Julie, right? Who is a pleaser, we learned, right? So I was thinking I know you guys are sort of struggling, how to get rid of Julie being a pleaser. I've got an idea. Keep talking about her at Mid-Pointe. So that, and I got a strict rule at home. Tarna's do not bring me up at Mid-Pointe. I just broke that rule. So that's where we're going to go. So where am I going to start? So I'm going to start here, right? I'm a huge Beatles fan, right? You could tell by my Beatles haircut, right? You got it. This guy's a Beatles fan. Look at that. So one of the things about the Beatles, who I've listened to all the documentaries that learned a lot about them, is that like in 1964 they came to America, but the 2 years before that or the 3 years before that, they spent a lot of time in Hamburg, Germany. So they played in a nightclub 7 days a week, and they played with there was multiple bands that played, and they were typically the last band that would play. And the bands that would play before them, they were all playing, all of the bands at that time were just playing cover music. So by the time the Beatles got on stage that night, like every one of their songs had been played, right? And actually, which is a very true story, and that was one of the inspirations for them to write their own music. Well, we've got How We Love, an 8-week study. We're a couple of weeks into this, and a lot of the songs have been played already. So I'm going to try and be a little bit creative right now in terms of how I attack this. So we're going to maybe come at it from a couple of different angles to try and sort of pull out some more information. And there's a lot of good sort of discussion topics that came from the discussion in the first couple of weeks that I want to bring out. I want to make sure that we're not taking for granted any of the thoughts or the concepts of this series. So we're going to do that at the beginning. We've got 2 or 3 discussion topics, and then at the end, or towards the back half, I'm going to talk about the avoider, which is one of the imprints or one of the inhibitors towards, getting or receiving emotional comfort. And if there's any time left at the end, we're going to talk about the Passover. So so it's incentive to get us through this quickly. So first things first. So we've got this continuum up here. Now, what the heck is this? So one of the things, like when I do any of my talks, or the way that I think about it is like, what's in it for the people who are here today, right? So, it's really important, right? Now, you guys are all investing an hour of your time, and despite whether we think something is interesting, it doesn't mean anything if in fact we don't sort of apply it to the people that are sitting in the room. So what I've got up here, and there's a couple of interesting things that, I want to sort of pull out of this, but one of the things is this is a continuum, which in essence I'm saying right on the far left hand of this continuum are marriages that are sort of in failing mode, right? Marriages where, are on the verge of divorce. And on the far right hand side is the perfect marriage, which probably most of us are in, right? We're all in the perfect marriage. And then the majority of the marriages actually sit right in the middle of this. Now, the thing about this book I think the book is great, by the way. I thought it was a lot of interesting, provoking thoughts. One of the areas, and maybe this is just me, how I study this, maybe the other speakers might think a little bit differently, is that in the book, these are marriage counselors, and the people who are coming to see them are people who are on the verge of divorce, right? And a lot of their techniques and guidance is geared towards helping people save their marriage, so to speak, right? So it's very reactionary, right? So one of the first things that I want to sort of bring out is that, for the fact that most marriages sit dead in the middle here, good marriages, great marriages, okay marriages, or functional marriages, or whatnot, this isn't a topic for people who have failing marriages. Otherwise, this topic would not be worthwhile to most of the people who are listening in. And what I think that the book sort of underplays a little bit, and I want to overplay this point, is that the techniques in this book are fantastic for people who are having failing marriages, but it's, again, very reactionary. And by the time people are sitting in the office paying $300, $400, $500 an hour for marital counsel, which is pretty expensive, they already have one foot out the door already. Now, to me, the benefit of this book is more towards, the people who are sitting right in the middle here, people who have functional marriages in some fashion, short of a perfect marriage, but you're kind of always working towards the right-hand side of this continuum. Right-hand side, it's left-hand side up here. Depends how we look at it, right? towards the perfect marriage. So that's really, really important to understand that everybody stands to benefit from this. And I don't want to sort of take for granted that, hey, we're throwing this out here and that everybody's like, well, this doesn't really apply to me, right? I think it could apply to anybody. I think everybody could benefit from this discussion and the concepts and themes from this book. The second thing that I wanted to bring out on this is sort of this whole notion of perfect marriage, right? So does that exist? Is there such a thing, right? We'll talk about that in a second. But the concept or theory that I kind of want to bring out is, perfect marriage is really sort of defined by, like, whoever, anyone, right? Anybody sort of defines, okay, what is the perfect marriage? What's the ideal marriage? What's, what's behind that? And whether you think your marriage is going well, whether you think you have anything to work on, is generally set by the context that you set in terms of what is an ideal marriage. And the one thing that I kind of want to bring out is that depending upon your definition, it could actually be sort of dangerous. And what I mean by that is that if your definition in terms of an ideal marriage, perfect marriage, starts with the fact that it's a marriage that exists without conflict, you kind of already set yourself up for problems, right? In, certainly my opinion. And really the essence of this book is the notion that there's conflict in everyone's marriage. There's conflict with any relationships. No two people think exactly alike, right? And if you start out with the notion of, oh yeah, conflict is bad, and as a result, if conflict is bad, we got to do everything in the world to avoid any sort of conflict because otherwise there's something wrong with our marriage, I think is bunk, right? I mean, I think you lose out on the opportunity of growing your marriage, right? So conflict is all hinged on what you do with conflict, right? And if done in a constructive way, you actually can grow in your marriage and move to the right place on this continuum, right? So with that, like, the whole notion of conflict, and actually could be a positive thing and actually can be a constructive thing and actually a necessary thing. Like, I mean, I remember there's like, I remember a couple of situations where, the couple were saying, oh, we never fight. We never have an argument. It's like 2 instances, literal instances, where several years after that, they ended in divorce. I'm sure it was an amicable divorce in that they didn't need a lawyer because they never fight. But it's just sort of a notion of like this whole book is sort of hinged on not avoiding like conflict, not avoiding your feelings at the risk of sort of like perceiving that there's something wrong with your marriage. So that's that point. But overall, I mean, again, sort of back to the essence of like this topic again, I think this applies to everyone, right? I mean, this topic and this theme applies to everyone. But before we move on, any thoughts on that? You could take the other side of the argument. You could share whatever you want. You could share nothing. And then I'm like stuck talking about the Passover. Oh.
Definitely agree with the conflict part. I think it's interesting we build more into that. It's how we handle conflict that's more the problem usually, not conflict itself. But in general, we know professionally facing all of that without disagreement, none of us grow. So the disagreement part is okay. It's what we do it, how we do it, that usually ends up one way or the other.
Totally agree. The failed marriage, I'm in the perfect marriage now, and my wife is homesick right now. But the failed part, a lot of times goes all the way through the majority of marriage into the perfect marriage. That a lot of the issues they mentioned seem to go on through that our whole life. And I think as you were saying, it's how you handle it through the time that until you have a perfect marriage, which we have a sinful world, so we lost already.
I don't think there's no such thing as a perfect marriage, but I also think that like all marriages like strive to be here, but they just vacillate back and forth, not to preview my talk next week, but well, like start, like when there's conflict, you may fall back towards where it's a struggle, and then when you communicate through that, I don't think that anybody sits at one spot on that line. I think they kind of move. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, thinking back to last week, how you were saying that like these couples, we never fight, we never argue, and then we get divorced because they're avoiding, right? But then we look back at the pleaser, where it's like you're constantly working on pleasing one another, so you like never fight, and then it kind of just explodes, and so it's fine, and then it's not. So it's interesting to see, although the two very different, how they both can sometimes end up the same.
Yeah, it's sort of what it's a really good point. And kind of what I'm trying to bring out is the fact that the thing that we're trying to avoid is actually necessary to making our marriages better, right? I mean, it's the whole conflict thing, and that's brought out over and over and over. And the counseling that's done, by these folks is really geared towards getting people to open up and really openly share their feelings in a somewhat non-threatening way, if there is such a thing. But any other thoughts? Good. Okay, so let's keep moving. So then the next thing. So again, sort of in summary then, what the theme of the book is, right? And a lot of really good talk the last couple of weeks in terms of bringing out all of the details and all the points. But when you just really boil down this book, it really comes down to, the theory. It's actually the book here is How We Love, right? I know we showed this, and so is it Milan or Milan, right? You said Milan last week. Is it Milan or Milan? Milan or Milan or? Milan? Wait, is it Milan? Milan. No, it's not Milan. Milan or is it the author, right? I could do the author. Is it potato or potato, right? Which way would you go on that one? So the author, that was a good suggestion. The authors of this book, really when you boil it down, is that, trying to help, they're bringing out the point, or their main theme is that emotional comfort makes a difference in a marriage, right? I mean, if you're able to provide emotional comfort to your spouse and get emotional comfort from your spouse, it's going to strengthen the marital bond. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And then they go into, like, what inhibits either spouse from giving or receiving emotional comfort, i.e. the inhibitors, which we started last week with one of the inhibitors with Laura, who talked about the pleaser. I'm going to be talking about the avoider. And then the techniques for overcoming those inhibitors, which really, in essence, is communication, right? I mean, that's the book, that's the theme, really, in a nutshell. But the whole notion of emotional comfort is kind of where I want to go next, right? And not taking for granted what this means, right? I mean, this emotional comfort, like, what does this mean, right? I mean, what does it mean to you, right? What does it mean to your spouse? How important is emotional comfort in your marriage? It could be really important. It could be inconsequential. Maybe you're getting everything that you think you need from this. Maybe your spouse isn't, right? But what does it mean for you? What does it mean? What do you think it means for your spouse? And then how do you seek it out? How do you give it? How do you receive it, within your own marriage, right? So we're gonna talk about this. You can answer any one of these three. You can answer only one of them. You can answer some other piece of it or whatnot. But if you don't answer at all, I will definitely know that you're an avoider. If you do answer, you're a pleaser. If you got your hand up, hand down, vacillator, right? If you take over the conversation, controller, right? I'm not pointed at anybody by it. If I call on you, you're the victim, right? And if you got a big smile on your face, you're the secure connector. So that's my take. But I know you. I've got you pegged, whatever way you go on this way. So one of the things I'm going to do I'll go first, right? I go first. I'm not going to vacillate. I'm going to take charge of this. And one of the things where I want to go in terms of like, my definition and my experience, with emotional comfort. So we'll go back to like the, one of the things that Don had brought out in his first session, right? Where Milan, Mylan, and Kay, they actually do conferences. And at the conference, they ask for a show of hands, like, show of hands, like how many people can remember a specific time in their childhood where they received emotional comfort from their parent. And, surprisingly so, only 20% of the people have a memory where they received emotional comfort. I mean, that thing of all the things that sort of stood out, that sort of just screams out. Well, I'm sort of here to say I'm not good or bad or whatever, but, I'll take it as a blessing. But I actually think I fall into the 20%, right? Because I could not only name one time, I could name probably 100 times, right? Because I had this incredibly close relationship with my mother. So, and like I'm not going to tell you about each 100 times, but it sort of boils down to, sort of her approach, right? So you think about like, my mother passed it when I was 22 years old, which was not good. But when I think about like growing up in my home and going through like really the teenage years, the preteen years and the teenage years, those are really, really tough years, right? Because you're dealing, the people that you associate with and the friends that you associate with are immature, right? I mean, so with immaturity comes insecurity. With insecurity comes a lot of shots that you take from your friends that really challenge your emotions, right? I mean, it's really very difficult to sort of deal with some of the things that kind of come at us, in those teenage years. And you're extremely vulnerable in the teenage years, and you want to be accepted. You want people to like you. You want things to kind of go well with your friends. And sometimes you compromise your own self for that, right? So as I was kind of, having the same struggles that I think every teenage person has, I had the really good fortune of like bringing those to my mother, right? And one of the things that's sort of boiling down the hundreds of times is that, like when I brought it to my mother, she was just, I mean, right off the bat, like, where did the comfort come? Well, first of all, she was just a great listener, right? I mean, she just listened without any sort of judgment. She didn't try to change my mind or challenge my feelings. She heard and accepted the feelings, and most of the time was very sympathetic to the feelings. But one of the things that she didn't do was say, hey, let me tell you how I can make this go away, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that, young, immature kids turn into old, immature adults, too. So, I mean, you never sort of escape sort of the critique of others in the things that kind of really hurt our feelings, so to speak. But what she did do that I thought was, quite amazing was the fact that she taught me to sort of, believe in myself, so to speak, right? It's like you control your self-esteem, not others, right? And so that is the one thing that you do control. And if you allow others to control your self-esteem, you're sort of DOA, right? I mean, you're not going to go anywhere. And then if you could be secure with yourself and like yourself, I mean, the first thing, if you want someone to respect you, you got to start out by respecting yourself and feeling good about yourself. And the one thing, sort of the cherry on top of all of that, was that she always made it known, whatever is happening, you always got me that believes in you, right? So, so you talk about emotional comfort. So when you get a taste of that, you want a whole lot more. I mean, so, and that, I guess, it falls in this secure connector thing, if, in terms of the definition. But once you know what it is, once you know what you're targeting, right? I mean, the whole thing about like emotional comfort being the, the bullseye, you gotta understand it before you can even seek it out. And once you understand it, seeking it out becomes much, much easier. So that's what emotional comfort means to me. On a scale from 1 to 10, as far as like how important is this in your marriage, I think it's a 10 plus, right? I mean, I don't know really how you could have a long-lasting marriage if you're not getting emotional comfort from your spouse. I mean, I've got 38 years to show for it, which is all really good. But last year when I was thinking about this and reflecting, we did the talk last year on love languages. And love languages, one of the things that came out from love languages is the fact that you've got sort of this beginning time when you first meet your spouse-to-be or whoever it is, and you've got this infatuation period of time, right, where, you know, you're head over heels, and it's a lot more, the connection is a lot more about physical than it is emotional, and then that kind of wears off, and then the realities of life set in, and then really increasing the bond or strengthening the bond really becomes more of an emotional thing than it is a physical thing. And you can see I'm sort of avoiding the S word when I'm saying physical, right? I'm dealing with the mature audience here. I could say sex, but when I say sex, I'm like a 62-year-old child that still giggles when I say that word, so I apologize. But the point being, emotional connection, emotional comfort, I think could be more important in a marriage. And then, you know, simply how do you seek it out? You got to have the courage and the guts to be able to share your feelings and emotions and not worry about sort of the critique, and not worry about the fact that, like when you think about it, like when you start sharing your emotions with your spouse, hey, this is how I feel, sometimes it feels like an indictment on your spouse, and it's easy for one side or the other to become somewhat defensive about the feelings that you're sharing. But if you never jump off that cliff and take that risk and deal with, you know, the conflict that could come with sharing your emotions, you're never going to advance on the continuum that we were sharing. So I went first. Someone has to go second. So, but any thoughts?
I think that for me, to feel that emotional comfort, I need to feel secure in the relationship. And to feel secure in that relationship, I need to ask for the emotional comfort from my husband. So that's what it kind of means to me, and what I do to receive that. Sometimes you just have to ask, because they don't know. That you need to.
Right. Like what, you know, what sort of circumstances like bring out situations where you're not feeling like you're getting it, or, because I don't know, my belief is that I don't think any spouse is intentionally trying to deprive one or the other of emotional comfort. It's maybe some of the, yeah, where do you?
I think it's personality with people, you know, different personalities. You have to realize what your partner, spouse, how they give emotional comfort and how they receive it. So you have to know that about your spouse or your partner. And for us, for me, I just have to ask. I don't believe there's anything wrong.
Not at all. I mean, that is really sort of the hurdle that everyone has to jump over. Yeah.
I like that where you have to ask. It's kind of how we are. Like, honey, can we just sit and talk tonight? And then even if he's had a bad day, he's very good at listening to my problem without having to take over the conversation. So setting aside that time, and like you said, Dave, being a good listener helps with the comfort.
Yeah, listening is really key, and listening sympathetically, empathetically is really a key. And I mean, it's what's sort of interesting too, like how I was sort of bringing out from my own personal experience is that, you know, there's that, you know, like you know, spouses obviously, you know, have a deep affection for each other, and like what's really difficult is like your spouse is sharing like, oh, this is the stuff that's just driving me nuts or insane, or it's hurting me just in general, you know, with life. What is the first reaction that you want to do as a spouse? You want to fix it, right? I mean, and that's exactly it. You want to fix it, and the problem like with fixing it is that, you know, there's so many things in life that are unfixable, right, that you cannot control. Right, but what I sort of believe that you really want to do is you want to get it out of your system more than anything. You want someone that could just sympathetically, empathetically listen, and then once you get out of your system, you feel there's a sense of relief that you get from just sharing, right, without any of that. Good, Don.
Dave, from one of the perspectives that
from speaking as a man, as a husband, and so many people, it's not part of our vocabulary, to show vulnerability, right? And that was, as a Christian now for 29 years, and Julie and I married for 38 years, it's, you know, still a work in progress. But being able to say things to her that are, you know, that hurts, or I'm scared, or I'm afraid, or whatever, that shows weakness, I mean, that's, as a husband, that's something where I simply don't go there. That's part of the emotional connecting, the emotional bonding, and it's so easy to go ahead and just box that up and compartmentalize it.
Yeah, I mean, that whole notion of vulnerability, and I actually bring that up here in just a few slides, is, I think, sort of dead on, right? I mean, it's like, you know, and sort of like that shows a sign of weakness. I mean, it shows a ton of strength, right? I mean, it's much easier to sort of avoid than to express, because you don't know what you're going to get in return, right? So it's just sort of you're dealing in the unknown. You don't know what you're going to get in return, and it might not be what you want, or it might be something totally different, or whatever. But that vulnerability is really a huge inhibitor. Makes it challenging for anybody to share like what their thoughts or what's on their mind.
I think the hard part with vulnerability is it requires trust. It's kind of chicken egg, what comes first. You can't go and talk to someone unless you put yourself out there. If I don't put myself out there, so I'm not sure if I can trust you. And that so often stands in the way of emotional comfort in any relationship.
Yeah, trust. I mean, and you know, what's sort of interesting too, like I know why I brought up sort of that marital continuum and the whole notion of conflict is that, you know, in trust doesn't necessarily have to be right at the moment either, right? I mean, so you might go through that entanglement, you know, as you're sort of going back and forth. But I could tell you something, like two people that truly love and care about each other reflect on sort of the things that just happened, right? And the difficulties, the conflict, and what's being said, and processing it, and ultimately you tend to gain, or you tend to build on that, and that trust begins to build, and it becomes easier and easier and easier, I think, as you're saying. But the first crack at it, it's pretty difficult. Yeah.
That stuck with me for a long time is, in order to have trust, you have to have safety first. So once safety is established, then you can build that trust. And then when you have safety and trust, then you can have the emotional intimacy, which then breeds into the physical intimacy. But it really kind of goes in that order.
That's a great point. And actually, they do bring up a lot of what you say, that the physical, if the lead is physical, you've got no foundation, but you build a foundation and then the physical gets better. But when you're talking about safety first, what do you mean by that? Like when you say you have to have safety?
Well, creating a safe environment, so when you are bringing your feelings to the forefront, that the other person's reaction is kind of like your mom's, like just being a good listener, being sympathetic, empathetic, caring, and just creating that safety so that person feels safe enough to share their feelings. Because I was kind of an avoider / pleaser, not totally sure, probably more of a pleaser, but yeah, I have a really hard time sharing my feelings, and it's a daily effort to like bring those to the forefront, and I have to have a really safe environment in order to do that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And if you've got that trust and you share it over and over and over, it's like sort of like perfecting the golf swing, right? You got to hit one good, and you're like, oh, I want to think about that and do it again and again. And then once you get confidence, it becomes much more automatic than.
And that builds the trust.
Right. And then it's
And
repeatable.
then that, creates that emotional intimacy that makes you really vulnerable to have the physical, true physical intimacy, the way God created it to be.
Really good. Thanks for sharing that. That's great.
Of like avoiders, everyone's very independent. It's not that, you know, if you had feelings or emotional support needs that they get shut down, but just like never did it, and so never developed that muscle. So, you know, going in, when I was dating, I got comments like, oh, you're like a robot. I was just like, oh, that doesn't feel good to hear that. But at the same time, you know, I can see that. And I found, like, personally, that one of those like first or second stepping stepping stones was starting with a physical feeling, sharing that, like, I'm really tired of this, like, situation, I'm tired, like, I'm really frustrated with the situation, right? And then that kind of, like, allowed that growth. That was a very safe thing to share, like a physical feeling, and then that kind of was able to evolve then into, that more emotional connection.
Great. Thanks. There you go.
For like number two, how important it is for you in your marital relationship. I think people legit are on like a spectrum of how much emotional comfort they need. Not like aside from are you a pleaser or avoider or whatever. Like some people, things just don't bother them, and so it's not something they feel this need to discuss more than other people. And we're all built differently. We all have different levels of resiliency and different, so you may have a spouse who maybe needs to talk through things and discuss things more than another spouse. And I think there's a level of understanding that too.
Right.
And understanding where your spouse probably does need to talk and where your spouse probably doesn't,
So your degree of like wanting or needing emotional comfort be completely different than your spouse, right? And sort of being tuned in on both sides of it are really important. Some of like too, like is sort of thinking like about the people who've never experienced emotional comfort. In some ways, I think like they don't know what they're missing, right? So there's a little bit of that, right? You kind of don't know what you don't know in some respects.
other aspects of it too, like, for me, I'm going to use my work side of it, but like, there are things that happen that other people are like horrified by that I'm just like,
Whatever.
And that's just the way we're wired. I mean, it has nothing to do with, did you experience this at home, or did you never experience it, never know what you need or anything, or, have needs that you didn't know existed. Like, there's just people who legit need less of that.
Right.
So.
Any last thoughts? Great. So one of the things that, I put up here that I started to think about too is that God's perspective on the marital bond, like Genesis 2:24, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. As it sort of struck me as like, well, how can you become one flesh if in fact you're not openly or can't openly share your feelings and your emotions? If that you're suppressing that, you're sort of creating separation, not unification. So for me, like this Bible verse sort of really, when you say, okay, what's God's perspective on the importance of emotional comfort and sharing your emotional feelings, I mean, I think you would say it's extremely important, right? I mean, relative to becoming united in one flesh. And then as far as like kind of moving on, like, so we kind of hit like, so we got a sense of like emotional comfort about what it means for us, what it means in our marriage, and the importance of it. And now kind of getting into the inhibitors, which, were introduced in the first couple of weeks. This is the piece, like as a child, the manner in which emotional challenges were addressed with your parents is underlined to your emotional relationship will be with your spouse. So obviously, like what happened, the type of emotional relationship that you had with your parents is likely going to play through in terms of the type of emotional relationship you're going to have with your spouse, per Mylan and Kay, right? And to a large extent, I think that that's true, right? And then again, the inhibitors that we're going to be that we're talking about here in these weeks right now, and then the techniques of kind of addressing them, which is, first, understanding your childhood relationship with your parent, openly being able to share your past with your spouse in communication without judgment, which is a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about here the last several minutes and in the first couple of weeks. So starting like with the whole like first technique in terms of like how do you obtain and receive comfort from your spouse, it's understanding your childhood relationship with your parent is number one on there. So this is the one thing that I sort of thought about that I wanted to bring out. And I know we've sort of like been trying to be apologetic about critiquing our parents, in terms of really getting to where we, need to get to, like, Exodus 20:12, honor your father and mother. And if the primary technique is first understanding and critiquing your childhood relationship with your parents, is this in conflict with this commandment? I mean, we can't, but you wanna.
And I think the key word is understanding. Back, I know Donnie and Laura both emphasized that. understand about ourselves helps us grow. We're not saying know this about yourself, period, stay stuck there. We're saying use this information as you go forward. So I think the key is understanding. I don't think it's in conflict at all.
I totally agree, and I think the book, when you read it in its full extent, they go in with the assumption that every father and mother are doing their very best, and they also keep in mind, kind of what we're talking about here. Your parents had parents, and so they were predisposed to a certain love style, etc. So they were kind of, I don't want to say handcuffed, but a little bit handcuffed coming in. And so, no, I don't think, I agree with Missy that they conflict with each other at all because of that assumption that everybody's doing their best as parents for their kids.
Yeah, and sort of flipping the question around a little bit, do you have a hard time, sort of, it is inherent to respect your parents, right? Does that sort of inherent respect that you have for your parents just in general make it difficult to critique your parents in any way, shape, or form?
I mean, maybe it is, like they said, sometimes understanding where your parents are coming from. Like, I have great respect for my parents. I think they did an amazing job raising their kids. But there's certainly things going on, but when you know where your parents come from and where their parents, my grandparents, were coming from, you can see it, and I can respect that and understand that and still want to do things differently,
Which I'd go further to say too, even as parents, don't we want our kids to do it even better? I think from that parental perspective, I know I'm not doing it perfect, and then you take what you're learning from me and do it even better.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's like one of the, as I sort of jotted down points for myself, absolutely. What parent doesn't want their kids to be better off than what you are, where you're at? Particularly in terms of the emotional side, right? I don't even know, sometimes even parents, if they even have enough awareness of their own shortcomings, right? Nobody's perfect. That was the whole, continuum. Nothing is, we're imperfect beings to begin with. That's the whole nature of our faith and our religion, is our imperfection, and thank goodness that there's a Savior out there to take care of that. So the whole notion of critiquing without judgment is actually beneficial, and most parents ultimately, if it's going to help your behavioral side, your emotional side, what parent wouldn't want something better for their own children is kind of where I sort of landed on this.
I think this is one of the great things about Jesus coming to earth as a child. He had parents. He would have been fully aware of all of their shortcomings, right? Obviously, Jesus was honoring Mary and Joseph. So I think that you certainly can understand where your parents fall short while still honoring them. Because clearly Jesus did it, so I think we can as well.
And our faith the foundation of our faith is about forgiveness too, right? So shortcomings are whatever. The essence of our faith is around forgiveness. So should have no trouble. Hopefully this isn't a barrier and an inhibitor. Any last thoughts on this one? We're just moving right along here, right? So now to the avoider, right? So the avoider, the definition of the avoider is people who are imprinted to be hyper independent. That is someone who has an avoider love style. And ultimately, what are people avoiding? It's obvious. They're avoiding sharing their feelings and emotions, right? Because we already talked about, we've used the word vulnerability a number of times, because sharing your feelings and your emotions creates a ton of vulnerability, and avoiders want to avoid it like the plague, right? And then they also want to avoid any sort of feelings of having any neediness, and and really having honest reflection about themselves, which is difficult to do. It's difficult to look at yourself in the mirror and be self-aware of who you are and what your own shortcomings are. So avoiders avoid all of that stuff, in all circumstances. So what is the cause? Again, staying with the theme of the book, is that, they look into the characteristics of parents of avoiders, right? And characteristics of parents of avoiders finds their child's needs and emotions to be overwhelming and irritating, right? They themselves have a difficult time dealing with emotions, so they want to avoid and deflect, their children sharing their emotions with them, at all cost, right? So when it's being shared, I mean, it brings a lot of tension to their parents. And I think the point that was just brought up here just a few minutes ago, chances are their parents were probably no different, and it sort of passes down generation to generation. And as a result, parents want to, ultimately will downplay the feelings and emotions of their children, and as such, they don't really have the ability to provide the comfort to the emotional needs of their children. So that's the parent side. A lot, so not, I think, would guess probably like out of the 4 categories, I would think avoider is probably one of the top ones in terms of, styles. And then reactions by the children are, because children by their very nature want to please their parents at all costs, right? I mean, they want to figure out like how they can get the acceptance that they're seeking from their parents, knowing that their parents don't want them to share their emotions and feelings. What do? They recognize that independence pleases their parents, right? So they become independent, and what do? They're suppressing their feelings and their emotions from their parent, which sort of just continues to sort of build the cycle of this, right? They also want to demonstrate sort of this hyper independence that they can take care of themselves, that they're strong, that they don't need the emotional support that potentially that they really do need, and they just in essence sort of learn to live their lives without ever having to approach their parents for any sort of emotional comfort, right? So that's what's kind of going on here. So one of the things that I saw in the book, sort of the avoider theme song. I am a rock, I am an island, a rock feels no pain, an island never cries, the Paul Simon song. I mean, this to me sort of hits when I read this, I'm like, oh, this explains it in the song that I love so much. But I'm a Beatles fan first, but this is I think tells the story really well. Having that as the backdrop, right? Can you relate to an avoider love style? I mean, a lot of people have like already sort of brought up, the point that they come from an avoider parent. Can you relate to this? Is there anything that you can share about, an avoider? Have you been in that situation or not? Anything that, yeah.
When I grew up, my parents would say, big boys don't cry. And so,
I heard that. I like that song too.
Oh, yeah. I didn't know that.
It's, yeah, who sings it? Not the Beatles. Go ahead. Yeah, not the Beatles.
I'm too old.
I'm too young. I'm too young for the Beatles. Not really.
But anyway, when your parents keep telling you that, and actually act out that, for instance, my parents never told me they loved me, which kind of drove me away, in a way, to become very, very independent. Where I'll figure it out. If I get in a problem, I'll figure it out. Once in a while it'll be wrong, sometimes it'll be right. But I think avoider, not even yet. I hate to ask people for help. I love people when they come and say, "Will you help me?"
Yeah.
And in a way that's so avoiders are I'm a good one.
Avoiders are pleasers too.
Pleasers too, yeah. And it's interesting when I took that personality inventory, that I was very high on both of them.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of hit some there. I mean, a lot of what you just talked about, it's right here in the book. I mean, so that is, characteristic.
One of the most difficult parts is an avoider is constantly reinforced in their behavior because it does please someone in their family, so it is a tough one to change,
Yeah,
for that reason.
my profession, well, I'm a pastor, but also I was a hospital chaplain for many, many years. And so I know emotions, I could handle emotions very, very well. And being in a large hospital, there was a lot of emotions that were pumped in there, and I could avoid those. And that was my defense, I guess.
And again, reinforced by that family, you could unload, but I'm not getting anything, I mean, like, constantly reinforced.
It's really good.
Okay. So my family, and I know I'm not the only one, like,
I bet you are.
no. So my family background is Dutch, but grew up in a farming community, and I know they're in a lot of German, I mean, it was like the Reformed versus the Lutherans battle. So I know I'm not, like, there's a big culture of German and Dutch that grew up in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s with the avoider lifestyle. That's just how they parented. That was just the culture. And I feel like it was my generation that started that huge culture shift into, we actually should talk to our kids about their feelings and how to manage them and things like that. That did not happen 20, 30 years ago. And, you know, it's a big culture shift. It's a big shift in my brain. And, you know, I know I'm not the only one, like, because I talk to my friends and people whose families also grew up, you know, in those farming communities, or their parents were the farmers and stuff, and they have the same struggles. So I think the Germans and the Dutch and those Northern European cultures seem to be, you know, that's kind of how they are anyways. So.
Yeah, so culture does drive a lot of that.
Yeah.
A lot of times growing up in rural areas, you have a lot of room to go and be alone.
Right.
Out in the woods.
I think as a parent, with children who have a lot of emotions, sometimes it's a little bit tricky to decipher how serious those emotions are. You know, like, I used to have to ask one of my daughters, like, is it an injury or an injustice? Like, why are you crying right now? And so I'm a little bit avoider, and so it's a little, like, you take on a lot of emotions from your kids, and so it's hard to avoid that, but I can see where, like, that would, like, stick with them, and they might create patterns if you consistently kind of, like.
Like, I mean, parents want their kids' hurts to go away, right? I mean, you'd rather take on your kids' pain than your kids taking it on. Maybe I like that. We are all cut differently, right? Very good.
Like, for maybe a slight avoider, it's hard, like, especially if an acquaintance, more so than my kids. Maybe when an acquaintance, like, really opens up and shares a lot of feelings.
Okay.
If I have somebody at work cry in front of me, I am just like, you know, so that makes me super uncomfortable. And so with kids, you know, you're taking on a lot of their emotions, and so, you know, just thinking about how I make sure I don't screw them up too bad. It's really what it comes down to, by avoiding all of their feelings.
Sure, you're doing great.
Something that has been sticking with me is what you're saying about where you grew up, how you grew up, German, you know, rootsman kind of thing. You said you identify as an avoider, correct?
No, I'm the opposite of avoid.
You're a
I think it's-
vacillator. Oh, this
No,
is
no, I'm not a
perfect. Maybe
vacillator.
you are, maybe you're not.
I'm going to go back to the first slide here. We're going to recap everything. No, actually, I'm neither of those. I think I'm real comfortable sharing my feelings. I think I'm like what I would call a secure connector, so I have no trouble sharing
Okay.
my feelings. But those were all jokes. They weren't funny. Don't listen to anything I say.
What I was going to relate to is, you know, between us, we have 5 children, and, you know, we can point out our children children now who are grown and where they are, and yet all 5 of our children will fall somewhere different with the same parenting, with the same parents. And so some of this seems so heavy on parents. And I know my mother had very traumatic things happen when she was 3 years old. So, and then above her, so there's a lot of things, but I look at it and go, 5 children. I'm the same mom, and the same, but they're so different, and they'll all come out differently on each one of these. So I'm a little
Well, I mean,
confused, I guess.
Yeah, no, so it's sort of interesting. So like the story I shared about, like with my mom, talked to my oldest sister, it's a different story. She has a different story, I mean, which is like, oh, we like grow up in the same household, but, yeah, Don.
Intimacy imprint, and there's different circumstances, things change in life, there are different
Right.
crises that come up.
Yes.
And then that imprint, as they say, by 18 months, a lot of the imprint is set, and it's pretty much cemented by age 5. So we're all at different stages, different things going on in life, so it's going to imprint on kids differently.
And the one thing I also wanted to bring, that's really, really good, the one thing I wanted to bring out too, it's like we took the survey or whatever, and I think like love languages, it was like really easy to sort of say, hey, this is what I am. It was like very simple. This one's a little bit more murky. You know, I mean, like, and everybody sort of said it. I even felt it too when I took it. I'm like, oh, I'm a little bit of sort of everything. And a lot of it depends on the relationships that I have, which depends upon sort of where I'm at. But none of like, so like, I don't, the place to not sort of get hung up is like, am I a avoider, am I a pleaser, am I a vacillator, whatever they are. It's more about like what is getting in the way from being able to share your emotions with your spouse openly and honestly. I mean, that's really the essence of the book, right? So.
I think actually that's one of the challenges. We had like the circle, right? And one of the challenges for an avoider, actually the challenge of the spouse of the avoider is the spouse, because nothing's going wrong, right? Everything's fine. They think that they're much further to the right. The avoider, who's been like internalizing this and not actually talking about it, but maybe is feeling very upset about, things for years or whatever, they're actually much more on the left. And so like that disconnect, it's like if the spouse of the avoider knew that actually things were much further to the left, hey, let's talk about it, let's try to address it, right? So like that challenge is a little bit unique in couples where one of them is an avoider.
Yeah, and it's that disconnection that the whole book really sort of hits on, like how do you communicate effectively, right, to break that down. But how time flies. The next time we'll talk more about the Passover, but we're out of time right now. But I thought really good discussion. Thank you very much. And then we'll close in prayer, right? Okay. Dear God, thank you for bringing us all here together and talk about this topic, this challenging topic where I think we all feel a little bit vulnerable, really having to share honestly and openly our feelings, with our spouses and certainly in a group of people like this. But thank you for being with us and helping us feel secure enough to share the thoughts that certainly could only come from you and be honoring to you. Hope we all have a good week and look forward to continuing this study. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.